Good evening. My name is Matt Lejeune. Tonight we will be discussing the neurological condition known as synesthesia. Now, according to the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran, every human being perceives something of what psychologists call synesthesia, or the blending of specific areas of perception and reasoning in the brain. Synesthesia is a disease that clinically, or it's a condition that clinically affects around 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 people. But the implications apply to the brains of each of us. Synesthesia is a relatively rare but important disease that can be understood through neurological, artistic, and evolutionary views. We all struggle to know the minds of each other, viewed through the singular prism of our own minds. For example, how do I know that the blue that my friend sees is the same sort of color that I perceive? By understanding disorders like synesthesia, we can further our understanding of the human brain at large, because by viewing these very unique outliers of brains, by contrast, we can further understand how the normal functioning brain works and for what reason. I've read many books on the subject. I have been fascinated by the artwork of some of its patients, and I have further investigated the condition. Today I will introduce you to the neurological condition known as synesthesia, and we will discuss its implications for our own understanding of ourselves. So, synesthesia is a genetic disorder. It often manifests itself in a variety of ways. Some of the more relatively common ones may be the association of numbers with colors. So, for example, you're a synesthete. Whenever you perceive, not just see, but whenever you perceive the number 2, you may associate it with the color red. And this is just something I made up. This is just one potential example. The important thing to note is that this connection would persist throughout your entire life. Every time you have 2, you have red. They are one and the same in a sense. There's no way to trick the brain out of this. You might also have sounds, notes, musical notes and chords associated with colors. Now, this is a very interesting idea. Some of you may be wondering, well, do I have synesthesia? Well, luckily for you, I have here with me a very quick little test we can run. Excuse me. I want you to very briefly take a look at this picture I've drawn. This comes from an experiment done by Ramachandran, the neuroscientist I mentioned before. I want you to take a quick look at this and tell me what you think is going on here. Now, I'll jump right in. What I see is a jumble of 5s and 2s. Seemingly randomly placed. Well, I'd like to show you the exact same picture, same arrangement, with one small change that I've made. Now, how many of you noticed that the 2s make a triangle in this bottom corner? Maybe you have synesthesia if you did. These are the only 2s in the picture. A synesthete would have noticed this pattern, this triangle, right off, immediately by looking at the first black image. So the interesting thing to note here is that synesthesia can be proven, it can be clinically studied. Excuse me. Now, how is it that this can happen? Well, Ramachandran's experiments continued by using MRI technology to view the brain of these patients. His researchers discovered that, quite literally, pathways get crossed in the brain. So if you look at the surface of the brain, the area of the brain that is responsible for color information happens to be adjacent to the area that is responsible for number representation and sequencing of numbers. Well, in one of these patients, a gene mutation would have caused these pathways of these adjacent areas of the brain to mix and cross. This effectively changes perception entirely, and this is how synesthesia is represented in the brain. So now that we understand how synesthesia works, a bit of what it is, let's consider it in action. Let's look at some examples of it. For the most part, synesthesia is a harmless deviation in sensory experience. But according to researchers at MIT, they found the disease is almost 7 times more common in artists, musicians, generally in creative types. This is one of the reasons I'm so fascinated in it. Well, why might this be? The researchers determined that artistic talent is often a result of an enhanced ability to draw connections between seemingly unrelated things. We may call this metaphor, for example. The brains of these individuals are often more densely interconnected than others. Therefore, synesthesia would go hand in hand, and indeed it often does. Some examples very quickly. The music of Olivier Messiaen, the 20th century French composer. In every sound he produced, there's a corresponding visual play of color that, of course, in this case would only be known by the composer himself. The poetry of Arthur Rimbaud is another example. So finally, let's mention what this mutation means for us and what it means for future generations of humanity. We are all synesthetes to a point. If you look at the evolution of language, for example, often, and this is the case in English as it is in other languages, often images, shapes, will mirror the sounds of the words we associate with them. For example, a jagged shape may have a harsh sort of sound, whereas a more bulbous, maybe cloud-like shape may have a rounder sound. This is an example of shapes, of visual stimuli being mirrored in sounds that we produce, as well as the actual muscle movements of our mouths would also mirror these shapes. So today's disorder becomes tomorrow's skill. It's interesting to think about the evolution of our senses. The past were different than they are today. In the present, who knows that our senses will be the same as they are. So in conclusion, today I introduced you to this condition known as synesthesia. I examined its neurological basis, its effects on the brain and on human creativity, and finally, its place in human progress and evolution. Broadening our understanding of this, as well as many other psychological disorders, can bring us closer to an understanding of our own brains and closer to a knowledge of our own thoughts. Thank you.